But right now, we all know that different decades of the Shorthorn have different experiences, but they're somehow all the same. Right now, we're going to hear reminiscences from 3 Shorthorn staffers from 3 different decades, and we're going to hear some neat stuff. So I would like to introduce you to you and ask these people to come to the stage. Daphne Harkey, mother-in-law, Joe's, who was Shorthorn editor 1944-1945, and is here tonight. Mrs. Joes, would you come forward? Phil Vinson, who was on the Shorthorn staff during the 1950s. Donna Darovich, legendary editor from the 60s and early 70s. And the discussion will be moderated by Danny Woodward, who was Shorthorn editor 1997.
Before we begin, I want to take exception to what Lloyd just said. And he introduced Donna Darovich as the legendary editor, and then he introduced me as the editor from 1997. So, I do have something before we begin this panel that I would like to share with the group. In my current life away from the Shorthorn, I'm still on campus. I am special assistant to President Spaniolo here on campus, which involves speech writing and a number of other things like that. But the president couldn't be here and wrote a letter that he asked that I share with all of you. I don't know how many of you have ever met our president or know anything about him, but he's an exceptional man, and he is also a former college editor himself of his college paper. So he wrote, Dear Shorthorn alumni, congratulations on 92 years of excellence. All of us at UT Arlington are proud of your many successes, and we celebrate your indelible legacy on our campus. There are precious few things that nearly all of our alumni share, and the Shorthorn is at the top of that list. You've not only covered our university well for nearly a century and distinguished it with your many awards, you've become an integral part of what it means to be a Maverick. I'm sorry I can't be at your reunion tonight. I certainly appreciate and identify with all of you. Like you, my undergraduate experience was defined by the time I spent working on the student newspaper. I was proud to serve as its editor-in-chief, and more recently was humbled to be named to its Hall of Fame. Working at a college newspaper is as challenging as it is rewarding, and as thankless as it is satisfying. And whether you end up a lifelong journalist or you ultimately pursue other passions, your experiences in the newsroom will define you and prepare you for a remarkable future. I can't imagine how different my life would have been without those experiences, and I'm grateful for them. I'm also grateful for all of you and the tangible difference that you've made for so many. Every university has a student newspaper, but only UT Arlington has the Shorthorn, and only UT Arlington has all of you. Welcome home. Sincerely, James D. Spaniolo, President. Well, I was very excited when Lloyd asked me to moderate this panel, and I think the reason is because as you see in the special issue you have, and for those of you who have seen UT Arlington magazine, I had the great privilege of writing a story, sort of a Where Are They Now piece on a number of editors, which included, Donna was quoted in that story, and that was a lot of fun to write. So I think this will be a lot of fun for me to have a discussion with some of my former colleagues from different eras. I want to ask each of you a question specifically about your time, and then I have questions for all of you to answer. I'll start with Ms. Joes. You were editor in 44 and 45, or you were with the Shorthorn at that time. So tell us about what North Texas Agricultural College was like at that time. And I'm also curious about the Shorthorn's coverage of VE and VJ Day at the conclusion of World War II.
Back in those days, this college was referred to by everyone in this area and all over the state as NTAC, North Texas Agricultural College. The war was still on at the beginning of my tenure out here, and we had a lot of warriors, if you want to call them that, and they certainly were, because they went on to join the different phases of the of the Army, of the Marines and Navy. In 1945, I was not here when they wrote about the end of the war. I had gone on to TCU at that point because it was then only a 2-year college. And, but it was, a lot of the students were living on the campus, not on the campus, but they lived in houses that a lot of the students boarded at these houses, and some of the students were referred to as day dodgers. Do you remember that, any of you here? They were referred to as day dodgers because they just went back and forth every day to take their classes. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My next question is for Phil Vinson, who was a sports writer. Is that right? A sports editor in the early 1950s. By that time, this university had a new name, which was Arlington State College. It was the largest junior college in the Southwest. Lots of construction going on campus, including the beginning parts of this building that we're in tonight. How was Arlington State College different than what she just described as INTAC?
We were just sort of getting close to the peak of the great post-war boom at this college, and there were only, when I started in 1958, there were only about maybe 5,000 students at most. Do you remember how many students were here when you were here in the 40s?
No, I really don't.
Well, I think it was probably in the hundreds, maybe, not even 1,000 students. It was pretty small. And when I started, it was still a junior college, but the Texas legislature passed the act that made this college a 4-year institution my freshman year. So things started to change, and construction accelerated. And I was just asking Donna a couple of weeks ago on Facebook if she or anybody could tell me how many times this building, the UC, has been added on to. Do you know, Danny? Well, it's, I'm guessing at least 6 times. I mean, my first semester here, they were adding some wings out to either side. Then they filled in the center with a lot of new space. And then it went out each end, and one end expanded and the other end expanded, and it went up and out. And they just kept expanding it. And it's, you know, I don't know if they will continue to do that, but it seems pretty stable for the last few years. But as far as different, we still had some of the Texas A&M atmosphere that was held over from North Texas Agricultural College. And ROTC was very, very big. And of course, A&M had, you know, the Corps of Cadets, which was a big deal. And they sort of, there were some A&M type things that we did in ROTC. We all huddled together or sat together at football games and in uniform and things like that. And we had drill every Thursday and marched across the campus from one place to another. And so there was definitely a military flavor to what was going on. And as it turned out, that was kind of a bummer for me because when I started, you know, there was something in those days called Universal Military Training, UMT. In other words, everybody was exposed to the draft. And one of the ways you could sort of beat the draft was go into ROTC and go into the Army as an officer. And I got to thinking about it, and I thought, well, you know, I think I'd rather be an officer and maybe sit in an office or something like that instead of peeling potatoes or, you know, doing those menial kinds of chores. So I chose to take ROTC. Well, my major was journalism. I got into the journalism building, and the first thing I heard was, "We hate military, we hate military." There was this great kind of hostility to ROTC, and I didn't dare wear my uniform to class because of that. So anyway, I was kind of intimidated by that. Plus, the sponsor, the teacher I had, Professor Paul Blakeney, he was just a sweetheart of a guy. He was one of the greatest people I ever knew on this campus. But the guy who was in charge of being the advisor for the Shorthorn was Ben Cook. And I understand Ben has passed away. He was at the last Shorthorn reunion, and I was lucky enough to get to talk with him. We became good friends after a fashion, but my freshman year, when he was in charge of the Shorthorn, he scared me to death. And he really kind of discouraged me. And I had Dorothy Estes had been my high school journalism teacher at Poly High School in Fort Worth, and you know, she was very she treated people with kid gloves, and she had kind of babied me, to be honest about it. And so here I get thrown in with Ben Cook, who was like this gorilla, and he would read my stories that I was a reporter that first year. I'd turn in a story, and he'd just rip it to pieces and leave no doubt that he didn't think I had any writing ability at all. So I was so intimidated, I dropped out of journalism for about a year and lived in an old rooming house down here at Abram and Cooper. It's gone now. There's a travel agency or something there now, but it was Mrs. Burkhead's rooming house at the time, and it was quite a place. Well, I told somebody earlier today that I would be glad to serve on this panel, but the trouble was you were going to have to shut me up at some point, so I'll put an end to this segment right here and turn it over to somebody else. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You know, for many of us, I think it's interesting to hear about UT Arlington having hundreds of students or thousands of students. Now, for those of you who don't know, we have over 34,000 students. It's the largest UT Arlington's ever been. We're also the fastest growing university in the state of Texas right now, up about 20% over last year. So this is, like you describe, a growing university. We're in another phase where we're growing quite rapidly. Donna, I think one thing that you've always been connected to, or your tenure's editor was always connected to, is the Rebels to Mavericks issue. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how the Shorthorn played a role in that?
I can, Danny, but we have an issue we have to take care of before we begin.
What, how you're legendary and I'm not?
No. I'm representing the 60s.
Oh.
Okay? Here's what we got to talk about. We come in tonight to the reunion, and we see tables for the 70s and the 80s and the 2000s, and we look over here, where's the table for the 60s? And we got the outliers. Now, you know, don't mess with the 60s, because when we were here, we marched, but in a different way for a different reason. So I would like to let my colleagues in the 60s give me a fist. All right, all right. Seriously, we don't mind being left out. I hate to even call attention to that, because y'all, if you weren't journalists, you'd start doing the math and figure out how old I am, but I'm not worried, because I know you won't know how to do that, because I don't. I have to add one thing before I talk about the Rebel theme stuff is, and this is mainly for the students here who are here today, when I was here at UTA, and some of the rest of you, tuition was $4 an hour. For $50, and I complained about the $50, and my books were maybe $35. So, But the question is about the transition from the Rebel theme to the Mavericks. It was really a very painful time for the university, and it was a great experience for me as an editor, because sometimes, I know all of you that have been editors, there are big things, negative things that happen when you're editor, but for some of us, there were some really big bad things. Those of you who went through the transition when President Amaker left and the provost left, I know that was a big one, and there's certainly been some others, and she certainly had many of them, but the Rebel thing was a very painful, and it really divided the campus. So it was good professional experience for me to learn to make a tough decision, but it most of all taught me that sometimes you make the wrong decision and you have to come back and say, and this is the hardest thing for a journalist many times, is to say, I was wrong. I had things to back up what I felt about, and I will be honest with you now that he sort of outed me, and if those of you didn't know anyway, originally I was for the Rebel theme. We were just talking about that at our table, but it became such a divisive, painful issue on campus, and when we had so few African American students here then, it was frankly, and everybody on the Shorthorn staff was white. So we really, truly didn't understand why the black students were offended by it. And so when at first we were all for it, that was why. But and we didn't have many African American students, so when they really started coming forward, and Bruce Meyer, my colleague for the Arlington Review magazine, is in the audience, and when he was editor of the Review, there was an essay written by a black student named James Wyman called Old Fires, and that's really what initiated the whole Rebel theme controversy and its eventual downfall, because he made us know this is why we're offended by it. And even though for some of us, we still didn't and may never understand, we knew it hurt them, and we didn't want to be the cause of that kind of divisive hurt at UTA. So I cringed a while ago when I saw the paper from 66 maybe. Every year at homecoming, we always ran the Rebel flag, the big blue overlay on the front page. And if you notice the woman's picture there, she was Miss Dixie Belle. So we had a Miss Dixie Belle instead of a homecoming queen. But I remember I faced a painful decision. It was a tradition that we always ran that flag. But I had to make the call, do we run it or do we not? And I made a bad call because we ran it. And they burned many of them in front of the student center. And there was violence. It was really bad. In retrospect, I probably made an error. But again, that was my experience with the Shorthorn, was learning you got to make a tough stand, but you got to be willing to back it up, and then maybe you have to admit that you were wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. You know, you beautifully segued to my next question. I want to ask each of you briefly to tell me, what is the biggest thing you learned while working on the Shorthorn? The greatest lesson?
Mine was when one of the male staff members says, we could have a lot more money to party with if we just each took 2 per diems, but we stayed in the same hotel room. That was something I learned was not a good idea. I'm stalling.
Well, I learned that I guess one of my first lessons was never trust the printers. I had several jobs later on where I was in charge of makeup and supervising the printing of the composition of the paper, and you know, a lot of times you would see a typo or an error in a story. You'd mark it and send in a correction, and in the process of making the correction, they'd screw up something else. So there were good printers, and then there were printers that you just didn't trust, and you had to learn which ones you could trust and which ones you couldn't, and you know, deal with the ones that you could trust most of the time. But I learned a lot of other things. I was sports editor. I was never editor-in-chief of the Shorthorn, but I was sports editor. And I learned that there was something called coach speak, and used to have to go interview Chena Gilstrap and Tom Tinker and some of the athletic coaches, and I had to learn to translate some of the coach speak that I got. One of my favorite things that coaches always said, to sort of avoid answering a question, is the phrase "real good." How is the Louisiana Tech team stack up? Oh, they're a real good team. Well, what about their quarterback? Oh, he's a real good player. And what do you think of your chances in the conference this year? Oh, we think they're real good. So there you go. Thank you.
I think I've probably answered it, so I'll yield.
It's still on. Thank you. I think that one of the things I learned, and I learned a lot, more than I can remember, I'm sure. I had Duncan Robinson as my staff person who watched over me when I was the editor of the paper. But I never will forget what a wonderful staff person he was to help me with the paper. And I remembered that we worked in one little room, and there weren't very many people working on the paper at that time. But I remember how understanding he was, and often we had to rewrite the whole darn thing, you know, to make it all fit. But I remember how wonderful Duncan Robinson was. He was a wonderful person to work for and with, and I just wanted to say that in his behalf because he was a wonderful person to work with.
Thank you all. This is a question I like to ask my fellow editors, and in the story I touched on this a little bit. It's the biggest challenge or the hardest call you had to make as editor. And for me, and I know Lloyd will remember this because my semester's editor was Lloyd's first semester as director of student pubs after Dorothy had retired. And so I was 19 years old and had just been at UT Arlington for like a year. And we had gotten word that a staff member here had committed suicide. And not only did she commit suicide, she did it in a particularly gruesome and horrific way. So I sent a photographer and an editor and a writer to cover it. And so they came back with a story, and it was the details of which were really, really difficult to read about. And so I had to decide, are we going to run this or not, and in full detail. And as I was still making up my mind what to do with this, her family calls and spends about maybe an hour screaming at me, asking who I report to. And I had tried to explain to them I'm the editor. And they said, but you're a student, you know, how does that work? And so they talked to Lloyd for a while, and we ended up running the story, and we ran a lot of the details of what happened. And I think we handled it okay. I think I made the right decision to include the things that we did. But not long after, they threatened to sue me, they threatened to sue Lloyd, they threatened to sue the university, the president, everybody. So it was a pretty tough time for me. Didn't really know what I was doing. But what about you, all of you? What kind of issues did you face? What was a particularly hard story that you had to decide, what do I do with this and how do we handle it?
Well, I don't recall any issues that we had that semester that I was sports editor that really required any tough decisions, other than just the usual production decisions that you make just getting the paper out. You know, the sports department is often called the toy department, so we didn't have any tough things. It was in the fall and mostly covering football games, and I have some great memories of the football games because Tom Vandergriff was the PA announcer at the football stadium, and I got to meet him and got to know him later as a reporter for the Star Telegram. But that was a lot of fun. But no big tough decisions mainly. It was just covering the games, writing sidebar stories, writing, future stories about the next game and so forth. And there was nothing controversial that required any big, tough decisions.
Wasn't a tough decision at all. It was just getting the paper out on time. But I think that the hardest thing was to do those headlines and to get those to come out right. But that was really kind of fun to do. But it really wasn't a decision. It was just part of doing the job. But I don't think it was a decision. It was just what had to be done, just doing that. Do you have any other question? Yeah.
She's right. I look at the Shorthorn now, and I think we only came out once a week, and we were still there 20 hours a day. Why did it take us so long to put out one paper, and you guys put it out every day? I don't know. Maybe because we like to hang out down there. This was not really a decision that was difficult on mine, and I know I said I think that rebel theme was a major one, and it was for me, but I applaud those of you who were on the paper in, 1987, because really the most painful decision that an editor had to make was when you were covering the dropping of football, because no matter how you feel about that, that probably really was the most painful thing the university has ever gone through, in Texas anyway, was dropping football. So that was a really hard one to cover. Were you in that group? Okay. Who was in that group? Late 80s. Who was on the paper when they dropped football? Okay, you have Theo. Okay, yeah. So.
I'm surprised nobody mentioned getting up and going to class as a difficult decision. Last question, and then I'll turn the program back over to Lloyd. For each of you, how do you think being editor shaped what you would become later in life?
I guess it was the closest thing to professional journalism that I'd experienced at that point. I mean, it was, I think working on the Shorthorn today, with it coming out 4 days a week and working under daily deadline pressures, is probably even closer to the real world. But as Donna said, we had a week to get everything ready, and you still had deadlines to deal with and so forth. And so it just took on sort of a professional air. And later, well, see, I had, when I was sports editor at the Shorthorn, I had been working at the Star-Telegram as a copy boy, and I got a chance to observe pretty much how a real newspaper was put together. And I realized once I was working on the Shorthorn that there wasn't that much difference. I mean, the writing wasn't as good, the editing wasn't as good, but the general principles that you were working under were very similar. And writing headlines was a real high pressure thing, and you'd sit there and sweat over a headline for hours sometimes, trying to get it to conform to the rules that were set out for us. And that came in very handy later, because I was after I'd been a reporter for a while, I ended up on the copy desk at the Star-Telegram, and your two main jobs are editing copy and writing headlines. And I think I got to be a pretty good headline writer, but it all started having to slave over those heads on the Shorthorn.
I had to write a sports column one time, and I thought, gosh, I can't write a sports column, but I had to write a column about a baseball game. And that was really a challenge for me, because I really didn't know much about that. But I'll tell you what, I learned a little bit about writing a baseball column after I got through with that. And writing a headline for that wasn't too easy either. But I did it, and I don't know that it's been of any particular value to me, except the except the fact I had to do it, and I did it.
I think kind of like Lloyd and a lot of you who are here, all I know is when I left the Shorthorn and graduated from UTA, when I went to my first job in a newsroom, I was totally prepared. When it came to writing, to headline, to editing, there wasn't anything I didn't know how to do. I'm not saying I was great at it, but I knew how to do it pretty damn good because of my experience at the Shorthorn. But I think the other thing I took away was learning to manage people, because, you know, I'm 19, 20 years old. I'd never managed anybody but when I was babysitting, so I didn't know how to manage people. And the rumor is true, I did drop kick one guy down the stairs one day because he made me mad, but, you know. Sometimes you learn about managing people too. That was probably not a good move. But I think, just like today, Shorthorn kids, when editors tell me, I know when somebody with Shorthorn experience shows up, they know what they're doing, and I don't have to tell them what to do.
Well, thank you all for joining us up here today. And you know, I'm struck by the fact that, you know, they're from different eras and than from I am, and I know that the current staff would agree with this too. It's amazing to hear that even back then the Shorthorn was preparing all of us to go on and do great things. So I think that that's a great testament to what the Shorthorn is and what it always will be. So thank you all.